I'm not the world's greatest movie buff, so if I talk about continuity errors in films, I'm way outside my area of expertise. But I do gather that in that wonderful film Forrest Gump, one of the key moments is when Forrest Gump buys some shares in the new firm Apple, an astute investment if ever anyone made one. The only problem is the film is set in 1975 and Apple isn't floated on the stock exchange until 5 years later. Or what about the film Spider-Man, which I've never seen, by the way, but where I gather Spider-Man in one scene kisses Mary Jane. Spider-Man is upside down, of course. How else would he be? And behind him are some windows, beautifully intact. And the only problem is that moments before in the film, Spider-Man has thrown the villains through those windows and smashed them to smithereens. Or what about the film The Wizard of Oz, which I have seen, when Dorothy approaches the Tin Man with an oil can, offering it to him to ease his rusty workings. Except that any chemist or engineer knows that if you're a Tin Man, one problem in life you don't have is rust, because there's no iron in tin. Okay, so we're being pedants. But I draw your attention to continuity errors because I spotted one in the story of Acts, which lies at the centre of our Pentecost celebrations. Or at least, if not a continuity error, a rather strange jump in the story. Acts chapter 2 begins with Luke's description of the remarkable phenomena of the gift of the Spirit. When the day of Pentecost had come, they, the apostles, were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. I always like to have a picture in my mind when I hear Bible stories. And here very clearly are the apostles sitting around in a house. Where else would they be? Luke then diverts to tell us a little bit more about what's going on in Jerusalem at the time. And of course, there were gatherings of Jews from the diaspora from all around the known world, certainly around the Mediterranean world. And after Luke has told us, we come back straight to the story. But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. And so we have Paul's little sermon. Now, the picture in my mind is Peter standing in the marketplace where the pilgrims are gathering and milling for the festival. And Luke does not tell us how Peter and his fellow apostles moved from being seated in the house to standing in the marketplace, let's say. Even though, actually you could say, that is the most remarkable and miraculous element of the story. How is it that those apostles changed from being men seated in a house, and perhaps women with them, to being those who stand in the marketplace and proclaim the gospel? Luke does not tell us. There's a jump in the story. Now, maybe it's not a continuity error. Maybe Luke's point is exactly that remarkable transformation is something that happens mysteriously and almost out of sight, as it were. We see the before and the after, but we don't actually see the transformation, because that's often the way it is with the working of God's Spirit. Maybe that's what Luke is telling us. But it does suggest to me, having noticed that jump in the story, that actually that transformation which we don't see is precisely the challenge that faces us as church on Pentecost Sunday. How do we change from being people commonly seated in a building to people who are out and standing in the marketplace. We are certainly people who classically spend an awful lot of our time sitting in our buildings, worshipping and gathering as fellowship. And when I talk about standing in the marketplace, I'm not being too literal and simplistic about that. I spend quite a lot of time walking around the city of Sheffield, and I come across, and I did this weekend, people whose Christian calling seems to be to stand in the marketplace and shout out the gospel. I'm not entirely sure that's the most successful way to share our faith. But there is something about being people who stand in the marketplace. It is about being people who make our faith count in the public realm and amongst those who are not yet, those who are part of our faith household. How do we become the kind of people who are not shut in the box that is church-shaped, but are living our faith in the world? That's the simple message. How is the Spirit at work in order to transform us? I know during lockdown, many churches, because we were not able to meet in our buildings and do the things that we commonly do, shut away in the boxes that are our churches, found all kinds of imaginative and creative ways to be what I would call street-facing churches, to use our gardens, our windows, our fascias onto the streets to speak of our faith. And wonderful that we did that. Many of us in our churches will go many steps beyond that, and will be involved in all kinds of activities that takes our faith from being seated in the room to being standing in the world. But I think no matter where we are and who we are and where our church is and what our church is doing, the miracle of Pentecost is constantly required. There's always that tendency to be drawn back into the room and to take our seats. How is the Spirit of God stirring us such that we find, in ways we may find hard to explain, those who, like Peter, are no longer seated in the room, but are standing in the world, living out our faith?